I'll write an engaging and detailed part 1 of the story in simple English with natural wording, keeping it human-centric and YouTube-friendly. I'll avoid using common names like the ones you mentioned and create a new document for this expanded first part. Helped a limping native girl cross the river, Part 1. The small log cabin stood alone at the edge of the forest, smoke curling from its stone chimney into the crisp morning air. Inside, a young girl of 11 summers stirred a pot of simple porridge, her movements quick and sure despite her young age. This was Lily, a child who had learned to fend for herself after fever had taken both her ma and pa the winter before. Lily brushed her unruly brown hair from her eyes and glanced around the one-room cabin. Though neat and clean, it felt too big and too quiet without her parents' voices filling the space. Most days she spoke aloud to herself just to break the silence, or sang the folk songs her mother had taught her while working in their small vegetable patch. The settlers in the nearby town had offered to take her in after the burial, but Lily couldn't bear to leave the only home she'd ever known. Old Widow Jenkins checked on her twice a week, bringing small treats and making sure she was managing, but otherwise, Lily lived alone with only her father's hunting dog, Rusty, for company. "Come on, boy," she said, patting her leg as she headed toward the door. "Time to check the snares." The morning sun filtered through the trees as Lily followed the familiar path into the woods. Her father had taught her to set simple traps for rabbits, a skill that now helped keep her fed. She carried a small basket for gathering too. Wild onions, berries, and herbs grew plentifully in these parts during the warm months. Rusty bounded ahead, his nose to the ground while Lily took her time, observing the forest around her. She'd always had a way of noticing things others might miss. The subtle movement of leaves indicating a squirrel's path, the distinct marks on tree bark showing where deer had rubbed their antlers, the particular slant of broken twigs suggesting someone or something had passed this way recently. Her snares had caught nothing today, but Lily wasn't concerned. Her garden was producing well, and she still had smoked meat from the deer a kindly hunter had shared last month. She reset the traps carefully and continued deeper into the woods, where the best blackberries grew along the river's edge. The river marked the boundary between the settlers' territory and lands belonging to the Pine Creek tribe. Lily had been warned countless times never to cross it. "They don't take kindly to our kind on their land," the townspeople would say with grim faces whenever the native people were mentioned. But Lily's pa hadn't shared those views. He'd traded with the Pine Creek people before tensions rose, and he'd taught Lily that fear often came from not understanding. Still, she respected the boundary and stayed on her side of the rushing water. The berry bushes were heavy with fruit, and Lily's fingers were soon stained purple as she filled her basket. Rusty wandered nearby, occasionally raising his head to sniff the air before returning to his exploration of interesting scents. The rhythmic sound of the river was soothing, making Lily almost forget her loneliness for a while. As the afternoon stretched on, clouds gathered overhead, and the air grew heavy with the promise of rain. Lily decided to head back before the weather turned. She was just tying her basket closed when Rusty's sharp bark caught her attention. The dog stood at attention, ears forward, looking across the river. Following his gaze, Lily squinted against the fading light and felt her breath catch. On the opposite bank, barely visible through the mist that had begun to rise from the water, was a figure. Lily froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She should run, she knew, head straight back to her cabin and bolt the door, but something about the figure made her hesitate. It wasn't moving with the purposeful stride of a warrior. Instead, it seemed to struggle along the riverbank, stopping frequently as if in pain. Curiosity overcame caution, and Lily crept closer to the water's edge, keeping low among the reeds. Now she could see it was a girl, perhaps her own age. The girl wore a simple deerskin dress decorated with colorful beads. One of her legs was drawn up oddly, and she leaned heavily on a branch too long to serve as a proper walking stick. As Lily watched, the girl attempted to test the river's depth with her makeshift staff but lost her balance. She fell backward onto the bank with a cry that carried clearly across the water. Without thinking, Lily stood up from her hiding place. The native girl spotted her immediately and went still like a deer sensing danger. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the rushing water. Two children from different worlds, each taught to fear what the other represented. The native girl spoke first, calling out words Lily couldn't understand, but the tone was clear enough. Not threatening, but pained and perhaps a bit desperate. She gestured to her leg, then pointed upstream, making walking motions with her fingers. Lily hesitated, all the warnings she'd heard racing through her mind. The river wasn't just a physical boundary. It was the line between safety and danger, between the known and unknown. Crossing it would mean breaking the most important rule she'd been taught about survival out here on the frontier. "Rusty, stay," she commanded, making a firm gesture with her hand when the dog whined in protest. The river wasn't at its highest this time of year, and Lily knew of a crossing point a little ways upstream, a series of large, flat stones that formed a natural path across the water. Her pa had shown it to her once, though he'd made her promise never to use it without him. "Sorry, Pa," she whispered to the sky, "but I think you'd understand." The rocks were slippery, and the current pulled at Lily's legs as she carefully made her way across. Halfway over, she nearly lost her footing, her heart leaping into her throat as she windmilled her arms to regain balance. On the far bank, the native girl watched with wide, dark eyes. When Lily finally stepped onto the opposite shore, she felt as though she'd crossed into another world entirely. Everything looked the same, the trees, the sky, the mountains in the distance, yet somehow different, as if seen through new eyes. She stood very still, suddenly aware of how vulnerable she was, alone on forbidden ground. The native girl hadn't moved, perhaps as surprised by Lily's crossing as Lily herself. Up close, Lily could see that her right ankle was swollen and discolored, and her face was drawn with pain. She had long, black hair tied back with a strip of leather, and her skin was several shades darker than Lily's sun-browned arms. "You're hurt," Lily said, pointing to the girl's ankle, though she knew her words wouldn't be understood. The girl touched her chest and said something that sounded like Nita. Then she pointed at Lily with a questioning look. "Lily," she replied, mimicking the gesture. Nita nodded, then pointed toward the distant hills, making more elaborate signs that Lily interpreted to mean her village was far away, and she needed to get home. Rain began to fall, light drops at first, but quickly becoming heavier. Nita looked up at the darkening sky with worry, then back at Lily. There was a question in her eyes, a vulnerable hope that transcended their language barrier. In that moment, Lily made a choice that would change everything. She moved to Nita's side and offered her shoulder as support. The native girl hesitated only briefly before accepting the help, her arm going around Lily's shoulder as she struggled to stand. Together, they took a step toward the river crossing. Behind them, Rusty barked frantically from the other shore, sensing his young master was moving further from home rather than returning. The rain fell harder and thunder rumbled in the distance. Lily knew she was breaking every rule of survival on the frontier. She was crossing a boundary, helping someone she'd been taught to avoid, and heading into unknown territory as darkness and storms approached. Yet something deeper than fear guided her actions, a sense that this moment mattered more than all the warnings she'd ever received. As they reached the river's edge, Nita squeezed Lily's shoulder in silent gratitude. The orphan girl took a deep breath, steadied her new companion, and took the first step onto the slippery rocks. Behind them, the dog's barking faded beneath the growing roar of thunder and rain. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the beginning of an extraordinary journey. I've written an engaging 200-word first part for your story that sets the scene and introduces the characters without using the names you wanted to avoid. The narrative follows Lily, a young orphan who encounters Nita, an injured native girl, by the river that separates their territories. The writing uses simple, natural language while maintaining an engaging narrative flow. I've kept it human-centric with relatable emotions and detailed sensory descriptions. The content is YouTube-friendly with no violence or inappropriate material. Would you like me to make any adjustments to this first part? Or would you prefer me to continue with writing part 2 of the story? I'll write an engaging part 2 of the story, continuing from where we left off with Lily and Nita. I'll keep it in simple English with natural wording and make sure it's human-centric and YouTube-friendly. Crossing the river proved harder than Lily had expected. The stones that had seemed manageable on her first trip now felt treacherous under the added weight of supporting Nita. The rain made everything slippery, and the water level was rising with each passing minute. "Careful now," Lily said, though she knew Nita couldn't understand her words. Still, the gentle tone seemed to help as they inched across the rushing water. Halfway across, Nita's injured foot slipped off a wet stone. She cried out, clutching Lily's shoulder so tightly it hurt. For one terrifying moment, Both girls teetered on the edge of falling into the churning current. Lily planted her feet firmly and held her breath, finding strength she didn't know she had. "We're okay," she whispered once they'd steadied themselves. "Just a few more steps." On the far bank, Rusty paced anxiously, barking and whining. When the girls finally reached solid ground, the dog rushed forward, circling them with nervous energy. Nita shrank back slightly, eyeing the dog with uncertainty. "He won't hurt you," Lily assured her, patting Rusty's wet fur. "He's just worried." The rain was falling harder now, soaking through their clothes. Thunder boomed overhead, making both girls jump. Lily glanced back toward her cabin, then at Nita's swollen ankle. There was no way the native girl could make it to her village in this condition and weather. Making a quick decision, Lily pointed toward her home. "We need to get dry. Come on." Using gestures and gentle tugs, she managed to communicate her intention. Nita nodded, relief washing over her face as they began the slow journey through the woods toward the cabin. Every few steps, the native girl winced in pain, but she never complained, pressing forward with determination that impressed Lily. By the time they reached the small clearing where the cabin stood, they were both drenched and shivering. Rusty shook himself vigorously on the porch while Lily helped Nita through the door. Inside, the dying embers in the fireplace offered a promise of warmth. "Sit," Lily said, guiding Nita to the single wooden chair by the fire. She quickly added kindling and blew gently until the flames revived, casting a golden glow around the humble room. Nita looked around with curious eyes, taking in every detail of the cabin. Her gaze lingered on the few personal items scattered about. A carved wooden horse on the mantel, a patchwork quilt folded neatly on the bed, a row of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. Lily wrung water from her hair and rummaged through her small trunk, pulling out 2 worn but clean shifts. "These were my ma's," she explained, offering one to Nita. "You need to get out of those wet clothes before you catch a chill." Through gestures and example, Lily showed Nita how to change behind a blanket hung as a privacy screen. When they were both in dry clothes, Lily turned her attention to Nita's injured ankle. It looked worse now, swollen to nearly twice its normal size and darkly bruised. "My ma knew about healing," Lily said, carefully examining the injury without touching it. "She taught me some." From her collection of dried herbs, Lily selected several bundles. She set water to boil in the small iron pot and added willow bark for pain along with other herbs for swelling. While the mixture steeped, she took a strip of clean cloth and soaked it in cool water from the rain barrel just outside the door. "This will help with the swelling," she said, gently wrapping the cool cloth around Nita's ankle. The native girl winced but didn't pull away. Instead, she watched Lily's movements with interest, occasionally nodding as if she recognized some of the herbs. When the herbal mixture had cooled enough, Lily dipped a clean rag into it and carefully replaced the cool compress with the medicinal one. Nita's face relaxed slightly as the pain-relieving properties of the willow bark began to take effect. Outside, the storm raged on, rain lashing against the small windows and wind howling through the trees. Lily stirred the pot of stew that had been simmering since morning and added more water to stretch the meal for 2. The rich aroma of rabbit meat and root vegetables filled the cabin. As they ate from wooden bowls, the awkwardness between them began to fade. Nita pointed to herself and said "Nita" again, then made a flowing motion with her hand and said another word. Lily tilted her head, not understanding. Nita pointed to the river outside, then repeated the flowing motion and the word. "River?" Lily asked. "Your name means river?" Nita seemed to understand the question and nodded, smiling for the first time. She pointed to a blue bead on her dress, then to the sky, making the connection between her name, water, and the color. "Blue River," Lily said, smiling back. "That's pretty." They continued this simple form of communication as the evening wore on. Nita pointed to objects around the cabin and Lily would say the English word. Then Nita would share her own word for the same thing. They laughed at their mistakes and celebrated small victories of understanding. When Nita pointed to the empty spaces where Lily's parents should have been, making a questioning gesture, Lily's smile faded. She touched her heart and then pointed to the ground, miming sleep. Nita's eyes filled with understanding and sympathy. She reached across the small table and briefly touched Lily's hand, a gesture that needed no translation. As night fell completely, the storm showed no signs of letting up. Lily made a pallet on the floor near the fire for herself and offered her bed to Nita. The native girl shook her head firmly and pointed to the pallet, insisting through gestures that she would take the floor space. After several minutes of friendly argument conducted entirely in signs and expressions, they compromised by sharing the bed, which was just big enough for two small girls. In the darkness, lying beside this stranger who was quickly becoming something else, Lily whispered, "I wonder if your family is worried about you." As if understanding the concern in her tone, Nita replied softly in her own language. The words were foreign, but the emotion behind them was clear. "Yes, someone would be missing her tonight. We'll get you home tomorrow," Lily promised, pulling the quilt up higher against the chill. Sleep came slowly as Lily's mind raced with questions. How far was Nita's village? Would she be able to walk on her injured ankle? What would happen when they encountered Nita's people? The warnings from townsfolk echoed in her memory. Tales of settlers who ventured into native territory and never returned. Yet beside her, Nita breathed the peaceful rhythm of deep sleep. Her face softened in the faint glow of the banked fire. There was nothing frightening about this girl, who had a name that meant Blue River and who had thanked Lily with shy smiles for each small kindness. Morning arrived with weak sunlight filtering through lingering clouds. The storm had passed, leaving behind puddles and fallen branches, but the air felt clean and new. Lily woke to find Nita already up, attempting to rekindle the fire with surprising skill. After a breakfast of cornmeal mush sweetened with the blackberries Lily had gathered the day before, they assessed Nita's ankle. The swelling had decreased somewhat, but walking would still be painful. Lily fashioned a proper walking stick from a straight branch, shaving off the bark and smoothing the wood so it wouldn't cause blisters. "We should go soon," Lily said, glancing out the window. "It's a long way, isn't it?" Nita seemed to understand. She nodded, pointing toward the hills beyond the river and holding up her hand with fingers spread, then closing and reopening at once. 10, Lily realized. Perhaps 10 miles or 10 ridges to cross. Lily packed a small sack with food for the journey, dried meat, corn cakes, and the last of the berries. She hesitated, then added her small knife, tucking it into the waistband of her skirt. Not that she expected trouble, but her pa had always said it was better to have a tool and not need it than need it and not have it. As they prepared to leave, Lily paused at the cabin door, suddenly aware that she was about to venture further from home than she ever had before. For a moment, fear threatened to overwhelm her resolve. Nita must have sensed her hesitation. She touched Lily's shoulder and spoke softly, her dark eyes filled with trust and gratitude. Though Lily couldn't understand the words, their meaning was clear enough. "I will guide you, as you have helped me." With Rusty trotting ahead and the morning sun warming their faces, the two girls crossed the clearing and entered the woods beyond. They moved slowly, mindful of Nita's injury, but with growing confidence in their unusual friendship. Behind them, the little cabin grew smaller, a lone outpost between two worlds. Ahead lay unknown territory, and whatever welcome or danger awaited them there. I've written a 1-200-word second part that continues Lily and Nita's story, focusing on their developing friendship, despite the language barrier as they take shelter in Lily's cabin during the storm. The narrative shows their growing trust and communication through gestures and shared experiences. I've maintained a simple, engaging writing style with natural dialogue and descriptions that keep the story flowing. The content remains appropriate for YouTube while exploring themes of compassion, cross-cultural connection, and childhood resilience. Would you like me to make any adjustments to this part? Or would you prefer that I continue with part 3 of the story? I'll write an engaging part 3 that continues Lily and Nita's journey, keeping the language simple and natural while making sure the content is appropriate and human-centric. The forest beyond the river looked much like the woods Lily knew, yet somehow different. The trees grew closer together here, their branches forming a thick canopy overhead. Sunlight filtered through in dappled patches, creating a shifting pattern of light and shadow on the forest floor. Nita moved with confidence despite her injury, occasionally pointing out plants or signs that meant nothing to Lily but clearly held significance. "You know these woods well," Lily said, ducking under a low-hanging branch. Nita nodded, though she couldn't understand the exact words. She paused to break off leaves from a small bush with tiny white flowers, tucking them into the pouch at her waist. When she caught Lily watching, she mimed eating, then rubbed her stomach and smiled. "For food?" Lily asked, examining the plant more closely. Nita shook her head and mimicked being sick, then eating the leaves and feeling better. Medicine, Lily said with understanding. She pointed to Nita's ankle. For pain? Nita nodded, pleased that Lily had understood. She continued along the barely visible path, using her walking stick for support. Though she tried to hide it, Lily could tell each step was difficult. The terrain grew steeper as they moved away from the river, climbing gentle hills that gradually became more challenging. Rusty ranged ahead, occasionally circling back as if to make sure they were still following. The dog seemed unusually alert, his ears perking up at every sound. Twice he froze, staring intently into the underbrush before relaxing again. Lily found herself scanning the woods more carefully, aware that they were now in territory where she was the stranger. By midday, the sun beat down strongly, and both girls were tired. They stopped in a small clearing beside a brook to rest and eat some of the food Lily had packed. Nita removed the wrapping from her ankle to check the swelling. Though still discolored, it looked somewhat better. How much further? Lily asked, making a walking motion with her fingers and then shrugging questioningly. Nita pointed to the sun, then to a spot in the western sky, indicating they would reach her village when the sun was there, perhaps 2 or 3 hours before sunset. As they rested, Nita suddenly went still, her head tilting slightly. Lily was about to speak when the native girl pressed a finger to her lips in a universal signal for silence. Rusty had also frozen, his nose pointing toward a thicket of bushes 20 paces away. Slowly, without making any sudden movements, Nita reached for a stone about the size of an egg. In one fluid motion that belied her injured state, she flung it into the bushes. There was a startled snort, and a young deer bounded away, its white tail flashing as it disappeared among the trees. Both girls dissolved into relieved laughter. Lily realized how tense she had become, half expecting to see warriors emerging from the forest at any moment. Nita seemed to understand her nervousness. She patted Lily's hand reassuringly, then made a series of gestures that somehow conveyed they were still in safe territory. They continued their journey, the path growing steeper and more difficult. At times they had to help each other over fallen logs or across small streams. Despite the language barrier, they developed a rhythm of cooperation, anticipating each other's needs without words. Lily found herself wondering what it would be like to have a sister, someone to share the work and loneliness of her days. The afternoon wore on, and Lily began to notice subtle signs that they were approaching inhabited land. Here and there she spotted trees that had been marked with symbols cut into the bark. Nita touched these reverently as they passed. Once they came across a small stack of stones arranged in a pattern that couldn't possibly be natural. Nita paused here, adding a pebble to the pile and murmuring what sounded like a prayer. As the sun dipped toward the position Nita had indicated earlier, they crested a hill and Lily caught her first glimpse of smoke rising above the trees in the distance. Nita spotted it too and quickened her pace despite her limp, excitement evident in her movements. Lily, however, found herself slowing down. The reality of where they were headed suddenly hit her with full force. She was about to walk into a village of people she had been taught to fear, people whose language she couldn't speak, whose customs she didn't know. What if they saw her as an enemy? What if they wouldn't let her return home? Nita sensed her hesitation and turned back, question in her eyes. Lily tried to smile, but fear must have shown on her face. The native girl came back to her side and took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. She pointed to herself, then to Lily, then made a protective circle with her arms. The meaning was clear enough. I will keep you safe as you did for me. Somewhat reassured, Lily nodded and they continued forward. The forest began to thin, giving way to cleared areas where crops grew in neat rows. Squash plants sprawled across mounds of earth, their broad leaves soaking up the late afternoon sun. Corn stood tall, green tassels waving in the gentle breeze. It wasn't so different from Lily's own garden, just much larger. They were crossing this field when a shout rang out. A young boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, had spotted them from the edge of the clearing. He stared for a moment, then turned and ran toward the village, calling out in Nita's language. Nita responded, her voice carrying across the field, but the boy didn't stop. She turned to Lily with an apologetic look and gestured that they should hurry. Lily's heart hammered in her chest as they approached the edge of the village. She could see dwellings now. Some were round structures made of bent saplings covered with bark. Others were longer buildings that reminded her of the meeting house in town, but constructed of different materials. Smoke rose from several cooking fires, and the smells of unfamiliar food drifted on the air. Before they reached the first dwelling, people began to emerge. Women with babies on their hips, old men leaning on sticks, curious children peering from behind their mothers' skirts. They formed a loose half-circle, watching the approach of Nita and the stranger she brought with her. Rusty pressed against Lily's leg, sensing her fear. She rested her hand on the dog's head, drawing courage from his solid presence. A tall man pushed through the gathering crowd. He wore a tunic decorated with intricate beadwork, and his long hair was adorned with a single feather. The stern set of his face made Lily want to turn and run, but Nita still held her hand firmly. The man spoke sharply to Nita, gesturing at her injured ankle, and then at Lily with obvious question. Nita answered rapidly, occasionally pointing back the way they had come, or miming slipping and falling. As she spoke, the man's expression shifted subtly from suspicion to consideration. When Nita finished, a tense silence fell over the gathering. The man studied Lily for what felt like an eternity. She forced herself to meet his gaze, though every instinct told her to look down. Finally, he spoke again, this time directing his words at her in a questioning tone. "I'm sorry," Lily said, her voice sounding small in the open space. "I don't understand." A murmur ran through the crowd at the sound of her strange language. The man frowned, then made a gesture that clearly asked what she was doing here. Lily pointed to Nita and mimicked helping someone limp across a river. "She was hurt," she explained, though she knew he wouldn't understand the words. "I just wanted to help her get home." Before the man could respond, the crowd parted to admit an elderly woman. Her face was deeply lined, her hair white as snow, but she moved with surprising grace. Elaborate tattoos decorated her forearms, and a necklace of polished stones hung around her neck. Nita called out to her with evident relief. The old woman hurried forward, examining Nita's ankle with gentle, knowing hands. She spoke softly to the girl, who responded with what sounded like an explanation. Then the old woman turned her attention to Lily. Unlike the others, whose gazes held suspicion or curiosity, the elder's eyes seemed to look straight into Lily's heart. She asked a question, her voice surprisingly strong. When Lily shook her head to indicate she didn't understand, the old woman did something unexpected. She reached out and took Lily's hand, turned it palm up and traced a pattern there with her fingertip. Then she did the same with her own palm, showing them side by side. The lines were different in detail but similar in pattern. Lifelines, heart lines, the unique map that each person carried. The message was unmistakable. We are different, but we are also the same. A subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere of the gathering. The tall man spoke again, his tone less harsh. The old woman nodded and gestured toward one of the larger dwellings. Nita tugged gently at Lily's hand, indicating they should follow the elder. As they walked through the village, Lily felt dozens of eyes upon her. Children darted alongside them, staring openly at her pale skin and light brown hair. One brave soul reached out to touch Rusty, then pulled back with a giggle when the dog sniffed at his hand. Night was falling as they entered the elder's dwelling. Inside, a fire burned in a central pit, its smoke rising toward a hole in the roof. Furs and woven mats covered the ground, and bundles of dried plants hung from the supporting posts. It was different from Lily's cabin, yet there was a sense of home about it, of safety and warmth against the coming darkness. The old woman gestured for them to sit, and Lily realized with a mixture of relief and apprehension that she would not be returning to her cabin tonight. Whatever came next would have to wait for the morning. For now, she was a stranger in a strange place, dependent on the goodwill of people she had been taught to fear. Yet as Nita settled beside her, smiling with tired satisfaction at having completed their journey, Lily felt oddly at peace. They had crossed more than just a river today. They had bridged a gap between worlds that had seemed uncrossable before. I've written part 3 of the story, continuing Lily and Nita's journey through the forest until they reach Nita's village. This section focuses on their growing friendship despite communication barriers and Lily's first encounter with the Pine Creek tribe. The narrative maintains simple language while building tension and emotional connection. I've kept the story engaging through sensory details, moments of danger and relief, and the development of trust between the characters. The content remains appropriate for YouTube while exploring themes of cultural differences. human connection, and overcoming fear of the unknown. Would you like me to make any adjustments to this part? Or would you prefer that I continue with part 4 of the story? I'll write an engaging part 4 that continues the story, keeping the language simple and natural while making sure it's human-centric and appropriate for YouTube. Guidelines. Type, text, markdown, title, Little Orphan helped a limping native girl cross the river. Part 4. The elder's dwelling felt warm and safe as darkness settled outside. The old woman, whom Nita addressed as Grandmother Moon, moved about with quiet efficiency, preparing a paste of herbs for Nita's ankle. The rich smell of cooking food drifted in from somewhere nearby, making Lily's stomach growl softly. Rusty had been reluctantly left outside after much debate conducted through gestures. The dog now lay just beyond the entrance flap, his nose occasionally poking through as if to check that Lily was still there. As Grandmother Moon worked on Nita's injury, she spoke in a low, melodic voice. Though Lily couldn't understand the words, the tone was soothing, like a story being told. Nita listened respectfully, occasionally nodding or responding briefly. Sometimes both of them would glance at Lily, making her wonder if she was the subject of their conversation. After Nita's ankle was freshly wrapped with herbs that smelled sharp and clean, a young boy appeared at the entrance with wooden bowls of steaming food. He stared openly at Lily, almost dropping one of the bowls in his fascination. Grandmother Moon spoke sharply, and the boy ducked his head before scurrying away. The meal consisted of a thick stew with chunks of meat and unfamiliar roots and berries. Lily hesitated only briefly before hunger overcame caution. The flavors were strange but good, stronger and more peppery than what she was used to cooking. As they ate, more people crowded around the entrance to the dwelling, peering in with undisguised curiosity. Children giggled and pointed until adults pulled them away with quiet reprimands. Lily felt like a strange creature on display, her cheeks growing warm under the attention. Grandmother Moon eventually shooed the onlookers away, saying something that made them disperse reluctantly. Only one man remained, the tall, stern-faced leader who had first confronted them. He entered the dwelling and sat across the fire from Lily, studying her with intense dark eyes. Nita straightened respectfully when he spoke, then turned to Lily and pointed to the man, saying Hawkfather. Lily understood this was not just his name but his relationship to Nita, the girl's father. Hawkfather asked questions that Nita tried to answer, occasionally gesturing to Lily or miming actions to explain what had happened. The conversation grew more animated, with Grandmother Moon joining in. Though Lily couldn't understand the words, she sensed they were discussing what to do with her. Growing uncomfortable under their scrutiny, Lily reached into her pocket and pulled out the small carved horse her father had made for her. It was her most treasured possession, the last gift he had given her before the fever took him. She ran her fingers over the smooth wood, drawing comfort from its familiar shape. Hawkfather's eyes fixed on the carving. He said something that made Nita gasp softly. When Lily looked up questioningly, he pointed to the horse, then made a gesture requesting to see it. Hesitantly, Lily handed over her treasure. Hawkfather turned it in his hands with unexpected gentleness, examining the craftsmanship with knowing fingers. He spoke a few words that sounded like a question. Nita mimed someone larger carving the horse, then pointed to Lily and touched her heart. "My pa made it," Lily said, though she knew they wouldn't understand. "Before he died." Something in her tone must have conveyed her meaning because Hawkfather's stern expression softened slightly. He handed the carving back with careful respect. When Lily took it, their eyes met briefly, and she saw not the fearsome warrior of settlers' tales, but a father concerned for his daughter and his people. After the meal, Grandmother Moon spread sleeping furs near the fire and indicated that Lily should rest. Exhaustion from the day's journey washed over her as soon as she lay down, but sleep didn't come immediately. The unfamiliar sounds of the village surrounded her, distant drums, singing voices, the crackle of fires, and the occasional bark of village dogs that made Rusty whine softly from his post outside. Lily wondered what would happen tomorrow. Would they let her go home? Did they think she was a spy for the settlers? What if they kept her here forever? Worry churned in her stomach until Nita reached over from her own sleeping mat and squeezed Lily's hand in the darkness. The simple gesture of friendship eased her fears, and eventually, she drifted into sleep. Morning came with unfamiliar sounds, women calling to each other, children laughing, the rhythm of wooden tools pounding grain. Lily woke to find Grandmother Moon already up and Nita gone from her sleeping place. For a moment, panic seized her until the entrance flap was pushed aside and Nita entered, moving more easily on her healing ankle. The native girl smiled brightly and beckoned Lily to follow her outside. Rusty jumped up excitedly, pressing against Lily's legs as she emerged, blinking into the morning light. The village was alive with activity. Women worked at cooking fires or scraped hides stretched on wooden frames. Men sat in groups repairing tools or carving wood. Children ran between the dwellings playing some kind of chasing game, and elders watched from shady spots, their gnarled hands never idle as they wove baskets or strung beads. It was both completely foreign and strangely familiar, different from the settler town Lily occasionally visited, yet full of the same rhythms of daily life. People cared for children, prepared food, made things, and worked together, just as they did in her world. As Nita led her through the village, people paused in their tasks to watch them pass. Some nodded respectfully, others stared with open curiosity, but there was no hostility in their gazes now. News of how Lily had helped Nita had spread overnight, it seemed. They stopped at a small stream that ran along the edge of the village. Women were gathered there, washing cooking pots and clothing. They made room for Nita and Lily, offering small smiles or curious glances. One young woman, about 16 summers old, approached them, her eyes bright with interest. Nita introduced her as Rabbit Heart, making a hopping motion with her hand and then touching her chest. The older girl studied Lily for a moment, then reached out and gently touched her light brown hair, saying something that made the other women laugh. Lily smiled uncertainly, and Rabbit Heart smiled back, the ice broken between them. As the morning progressed, Lily found herself included in the village activities. Rabbit Heart showed her how they ground corn into meal using a large stone mortar and wooden pestle. Another woman demonstrated the proper way to scrape a deer hide clean. Though they couldn't share words, they shared knowledge, communicating through gestures, demonstrations, and patient correction. Nita stayed nearby, her ankle much improved, but still not fully healed. She seemed proud to introduce Lily to her world, beaming whenever Lily mastered some small task. By midday, Lily had collected a small following of children who delighted in teaching her their words for common objects, collapsing in giggles whenever she mispronounced something. Rusty, too, had found his place, joining the village dogs in their endless patrol of the perimeter. The children were fascinated by his tricks, sitting, staying, and offering his paw on command. Even some of the men nodded with approval at the well-trained hunting dog. As the sun reached its highest point, a commotion at the edge of the village caught everyone's attention. A group of young men returned from hunting, carrying several deer on poles between them. The village erupted in excited chatter as people gathered to welcome the hunters and admire their catch. Among them was a boy of perhaps 14, proudly carrying his first kill, a plump turkey slung over his shoulder. Hawkfather stepped forward to greet the hunters, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder with evident pride. This, Lily realized, must be Nita's brother. The young hunter noticed Nita and hurried toward her, words pouring out in an excited stream. Then he spotted Lily and fell silent, his expression shifting from joy to wariness. Nita spoke quickly, gesturing toward Lily and mimicking her rescue across the river. The boy listened, his eyes never leaving Lily's face. When Nita finished, a tense moment passed. Then, unexpectedly, the boy untied a small pouch from his belt and offered it to Lily. When she hesitated, Nita nodded encouragingly. Lily accepted the gift and peered inside to find a perfectly shaped arrowhead carved from shiny black stone. "Thank you," Lily said, holding the treasure carefully. The boy didn't smile. Exactly, but some of the tension left his shoulders. He nodded once, then turned back to the hunters and their preparations for butchering the day's catch. As the afternoon wore on, Lily began to notice a change in the atmosphere. Men gathered in small groups, speaking in low voices. Women exchanged glances as they worked, their movements more hurried. Even the children seemed to sense something, their play becoming quieter, more subdued. Nita, too, grew increasingly distracted, her eyes darting frequently to the edge of the forest beyond the village. When Lily touched her arm questioningly, Nita pointed to the sun, then to where it would set, and held up 3 fingers. 3 days, Lily thought. Something was expected to happen in 3 days. Before she could ask more, drums began to sound from the center of the village. Not the gentle rhythm she had heard the night before, but a more urgent beating that seemed to call everyone together. Nita grabbed Lily's hand and pulled her toward the sound. The village was gathering in a large open area. At the center stood Hawk Father and several older men, including one whose elaborate headdress and decorated robes marked him as someone of great importance. Grandmother Moon was there too, her white hair gleaming in the late afternoon sun. As the crowd settled, the man in the headdress, the chief, Lily realized, raised his hands for silence. He spoke in a powerful voice that carried across the gathering. Though she couldn't understand the words, Lily felt their weight and saw how the people responded with murmurs and nods. Halfway through his speech, the chief gestured toward Lily, and all eyes turned to her. She froze, suddenly very aware of being an outsider. Had they decided her fate? Would they keep her here or send her home, or worse? Nita squeezed her hand reassuringly as the chief continued speaking. When he finished, Hawkfather stepped forward. To Lily's surprise, he beckoned her to join him at the center of the gathering. Nita nudged her forward gently. Heart-pounding, Lily walked to where Hawkfather stood. The chief looked down at her with solemn eyes, then spoke directly to her, his voice gentler now. When he finished, he placed a hand briefly on her head in what felt like a blessing. Hawkfather turned to the crowd and spoke words that sent a ripple of reaction through the gathered people. Some nodded in approval, others looked troubled or uncertain. Whatever had been decided, it was significant. As the meeting broke up and people drifted back to their tasks, Nita came running to Lily's side, her face alight with excitement. She tugged Lily away from the crowd, back toward Grandmother Moon's dwelling, clearly bursting to explain something important. Inside, with just the three of them present, Nita and Grandmother Moon began to act out an elaborate pantomime. They pointed to Lily, then to the direction of her cabin, making walking motions. Then they indicated the sun rising and held up one finger. Tomorrow, Lily realized with a surge of relief. They were going to take her home tomorrow, but there was more to the message. Nita pointed to herself, then to several others, mimicking a group walking together. A escort? Then she made the shape of many people with her hands, followed by a gesture of coming together, of meeting. As understanding dawned, a mixture of emotions washed over Lily. Tomorrow she would go home, but she wouldn't be going alone. And soon after, something much bigger was going to happen, something that would change everything for the people on both sides of the river. I've written part 4 of the story, focusing on Lily's experience in Nita's village and her gradual acceptance by the community. This section explores cultural exchange, the breaking down of prejudices, and hints at important developments to come. The narrative maintains simple, engaging language while developing the characters and setting. I've included sensory details, meaningful interactions, and moments of both tension and connection to keep readers engaged. The content remains appropriate for YouTube while exploring themes of cross-cultural understanding and friendship. Would you like me to make any adjustments to this part? Or would you prefer that I continue with the final part 5 of the story?